Well, my ultimate aim is to suggest a direction that I think what I see as the living tradition of pragmatism, of an American philosophy that didn't end with the Second World War, but is still a developing tradition, to suggest some directions in which we might move, but perhaps characteristically for the way I approach things, to do that, I want to start going back and looking at the roots of American pragmatism in the German idealist tradition. I think developments over the last 4 decades have secured Immanuel Kant's status as being for contemporary philosophers what the sea was for the poet Swinburne, the great gray mother of us all. And Kant mattered as much for the classical American pragmatists as he does for us today. But we look back at that sepia-toned age across an extended period during which Anglophone philosophy largely read Kant out of its canon. The founding ideology of Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, articulating the rationale and fighting faith of the rising tide of analytic philosophy, was forged in a recoil from the perceived defects of a British idealism inspired by Hegel. And mindful of the massive debt evidently and self-avowedly owed by Hegel to Kant, and putting aside neo-Kantian readings of Kant as an empiricist philosopher of science that would have cast him in a light they found more favorable, Russell and Moore diagnosed the idealist rot as having set in already with Kant. And for them, and for many of their followers down through the years, the progressive current in philosophy should be seen to have run directly from Locke, Leibniz, and Hume to Mill and Frege without any dangerous diversion into the oxbow of German idealism. What is it that I take the pragmatists to have learned from Kant? I want to focus on 2 of his master ideas, what I'll call Kant's normative turn, and what I'll call, tendentiously but only proleptically, his pragmatist methodology. I think we should still care about these ideas today, ideas which were, for complicated reasons, largely invisible to classical analytic philosophy. As I understand his work, Kant's most basic idea, the axis around which all of his thought turns, is that what distinguishes exercises of judgment and intentional agency from the performances of merely natural creatures is that judgments and actions are subject to distinctive kinds of normative assessment. Judgments and actions are things we're in a distinctive sense responsible for. They're kinds of commitments that we undertake. Kant understands judging and acting as applying rules, concepts that determine what the subject becomes committed to and responsible for by applying them. Applying concepts theoretically in judgment and practically in action bind the concept user. They commit her. They make her responsible by opening her up to normative assessment according to rules she's made herself subject to. For Kant, the responsibility one undertakes by applying a concept is a task responsibility. It's a commitment to do something. On the theoretical side, what one is committed to doing, what one becomes liable to assessment as to one's success at doing, is integrating one's judgments into a whole that exhibits a distinctive kind of unity, what he called the synthetic unity of apperception. It's a systematic, rational unity, dynamically created and sustained by drawing inferential consequences from and finding reasons for one's judgments, and rejecting commitments incompatible with those one has undertaken. Apperceiving, the characteristically sapient form of awareness, is discursive, that is, conceptual awareness. For it consists in integrating judgments into a unity structured by relations of what judgments provide reasons for and against what others. And those rational relations among judgments are determined by the rules, that is, the concepts, that one binds oneself by in making the judgments. Each new episode of experience, paradigmatically the making of a perceptual judgment, requires integration into and hence transformation of, the antecedent constellation of commitments. New incompatibilities can arise, which must be dealt with critically by rejecting or modifying prior commitments. And new joint consequences can ensue, which must be acknowledged or rejected. The process by which the whole evolves and develops systematically is a paradigmatically rational one, structured by the rhythm of inhalation or amplification by acknowledging new commitments, and exhalation or criticism by rejecting or adjusting old commitments in light of their rational relations to the new ones. Kant's new normative conception of what the activity of judging consists in, of what one must be doing in order thereby to count as judging, puts important structural constraints on how he understands the judgeable contents for which one is taking responsibility in judgment. The dominant order of logical and semantic explanation in the tradition Kant inherited begins with a doctrine of terms or concepts. And on that basis, a doctrine of judgments was erected, and then finally a doctrine of consequences or syllogisms. But Kant saw that the minimum unit of responsibility is not the concept, but the judgment. It's judgments, not concepts, that one can invest one's authority in, commit oneself to, by integrating them into an evolving constellation that exhibits the rational synthetic unity characteristic of apperception. Accordingly, in a radical break with his predecessors, Kant takes judgments to be the minimal units of awareness and so experience. Concepts are to be understood analytically as functions of judgment, that is, in terms of the contribution they make to judgeable contents. To be candidates for synthesis into a system exhibiting the rational unity characteristic of apperception, judgments must stand to one another in relations of material consequence and incompatibility. So, if one is to understand judging also as the application of concepts, the first question one must ask about the contents of those concepts is how the use of one or another concepts affects those rational relations among the judgeable contents that result. This methodological inversion is Kant's commitment to the explanatory primacy of the propositional. It's a methodological commitment that will be seconded by Frege, whose Begriffsschrift is structured by the observation that it's only judgeable contents to which pragmatic force can attach. And then again by Wittgenstein, who in the Investigations gives pride of place to sentences as the only kind of linguistic expression that can be used to make a move in a language game. Kant's thought here, I think, is that alongside the local order of explanation, which looks to the contents of the particular concepts applied in judging to explain the specific possibilities of rational integration of judgeable contents containing them, that is, their inferential grounds, consequences, and incompatibilities, beside that, there's a global order of explanation, according to which one must understand what conceptual content is in terms of what judgeable contents are, and must understand that in terms of what one is doing in judging, that is, in making oneself responsible for such contents. The functionalism, in a broad sense, about conceptual contents that consists in understanding them as functions of judgment, which is the practical expression of the methodological commitment to the explanatory primacy of the propositional, is motivated by an overarching methodological pragmatism, according to which semantics must answer to pragmatics, in a broad sense. It's the strategy of understanding discursive content in terms of what one is doing in endorsing or applying it, of approaching the notions of judgeable and therefore conceptual content generally in terms of constraints put on it by the requirements derived from the account of the activity of judging. Now, though I have, for expository reasons, focused my sketch on the cognitive theoretical side of Kant's thought, it's important to be clear that pragmatism in the sense I'm attributing to Kant is not a matter of giving explanatory priority to the practical over the theoretical, to exercises of agency over exercises of cognition. Rather, within both the practical and the theoretical spheres, it's understanding content in terms of force, in Frege's sense. What is judged, believed, or done in terms of what one must do, what activity one must engage in to be judging, believing, or intentionally doing it. Kant, I'm claiming, should be thought of as a pragmatist avant la lettre because of the way his normative theory of conceptual activity, both theoretical and practical, shapes his account of conceptual content, both theoretical and practical. And I read Hegel as taking over from Kant commitment both to a normative account of conceptual doings and to a broadly pragmatist approach to understanding the contents of our cognitive and practical commitments in terms of what we're doing in undertaking those commitments. I see him as taking an important step towards naturalizing the picture of conceptual norms by taking those norms to be instituted by public, social, recognitive practices. Further, Hegel tells a story about the very same social practice of rational integration of commitments undertaken by applying concepts that is the synthesis, for him, at once of recognized and recognizing individual subjects and of their recognitive communities, saying that that's at the very same time the historical process by which the norms that articulate the contents of the concepts applied are instituted, determined, and developed. He calls that ongoing social, historical process experience, Erfahrung, and he no longer sees it as taking place principally between the ears of an individual. Closer to our own time, we've seen a version of this development repeated, as Quine, in a pragmatist spirit at least, rejects Carnap's two-phase picture, according to which first one institutes meanings, a language, and then applies them, adopts a theory, in favor, for Quine, of a unitary process and practice of using expressions that must be intelligible at every stage as settling both what one means and how one is taking things to be. Now, as I understand them, in the broadest terms, the classical American pragmatists, the triumvirate, above all, of Peirce, James, and Dewey, developed this German idealist tradition by completing the process of naturalizing it, which had begun already with Hegel. In their hands, it was to take the form of an empirical scientific account of us and our transactions with our environment. The sort of understanding they sought was decisively shaped by two new models of scientific explanation, codifying two new forms of intelligibility characteristic of late 19th century science. Principal among these, of course, was Darwinian evolutionary explanations. The other form of explanation that was coming to maturity in the science of the day was statistical explanation. Pragmatism begins with a philosophy of science, pioneered by Peirce, that saw these two explanatory innovations as aspects of one conceptual revolution in science. One dimension along which evolutionary and statistical explanations differ from those of the older mathematical physics concern the dominant modality in which they're expressed. The modality of Newtonian laws is necessity. One explains something by showing that it's necessitated by eternal, exceptionless, universal laws. But evolutionary and statistical explanations explain contingent happenings by displaying conditions under which they can be seen to have been at least probable. Both are ways of making intelligible the contingent emergence of collective order from individual randomness. The original subject matter of evolutionary explanations was, of course, the process by which biological species arise and diversify. Taking his cue from the way in which the statistical explanation had been generalized from its original applications in social science to provide the basis for the triumph of thermodynamics in physics, Peirce substantially generalized evolutionary statistical forms of intelligibility along two different dimensions. Most important was the idea that was picked up and developed by James and above all by Dewey. This was the recognition that evolution at the level of species and learning at the level of individuals share a common selectional structure. Both can be understood as processes of adaptation, in which interaction with the environment preserves and reproduces, that is, selects, some elements while eliminating others. This insight is encapsulated in the concept habit, and the picture of individual learning as the evolution by selection of a population of habits. This master idea made possible the naturalistic construal of a cognitive continuum that runs from the skillful coping of the competent predator through the practical intelligence of primitive hominins down to the traditional practices and common sense of civilized humans, all the way to the most sophisticated theorizing of contemporary scientists. All are seen as of a piece with and intelligible in the same general terms as biological evolution. The other direction in which Peirce generalized the evolutionary statistical selectional model of explanation was to inorganic nature. What those older scientific naturalists, for whom the paradigm of scientific understanding was Newtonian physics rather than Darwinian biology, had taken to be eternal, immutable, necessary, universal laws of nature, Peirce now sees as themselves, in the largest sense, habits of the universe, a kind of order that's arisen contingently, but ultimately statistically explicably, by a selectional adaptational habitat to which all must collectively adapt, a selectional adaptational process operating on a population of such regularities. There's no guarantee that any such accommodation will succeed permanently. As with the habits learned by individuals, some of the law-like regularities may prove to be more robust and others more fragile. The older picture of laws shows up as at best only approximately true, an idealization extrapolating a situation that actuality approaches at most asymptotically. The naturalism of the classical American pragmatists was shaped by the new sort of nature they'd been taught about by the best science of their times, a nature viewed through the lens of the new forms of statistical and selectional explanation. And the pragmatists' new form of naturalism was coupled with a new form of empiricism. The experimental scientific method is seen as just the explicit principled distillation of the selectional learning process that is the practical form common to intelligent creatures at all stages of their development. Dewey's term for that process, in all its varieties, is experience, the axial concept of such central works as Experience in Nature and Art as Experience. Indeed, so central is the concept to Dewey's thought that it sometimes is difficult in reading these works to overcome the impression that he is, as my Dr. Frater Rorty once put it, using the term experience just as an incantatory device to blur every conceivable distinction. I don't think that's right, but experience in this sense is not the ignition of some internal Cartesian light. It's not the occurrence of a self-intimating event of pure awareness, transparent and incorrigible to the subject of experience. Experience is work, the application of force through distance. It's something done rather than something that merely happens. It's a process. It's engaging in a practice. It's the exercise of abilities rather than any kind of episode. It's experience not in the sense of Erlebnis or Empfindung, but of Hegel's Erfahrung. It's the decidedly non-Cartesian sense of experience in which a wanthead can specify no experience necessary without intending to invite applications from zombies. Earlier empiricists had thought of experience as the occurrence of conscious episodes that provide the raw materials for learning via processes such as association, comparison, and abstraction. For the pragmatists, though, experience isn't an input to the learning process, it just is the learning process. The process of perception and performance, followed by perception and assessment of the results of performance, and then further performance, exhibiting the iterative, adaptive, conditional branching structure of a test-operate, test-exit loop. The result of experience is not best thought of as the possession of something, items of knowledge, but as a kind of practical understanding, a kind of adaptive attunement to the environment, the development of habits apt for successful coping with contingencies. It's knowing how rather than knowing that. Now, ontological naturalism and epistemological empiricism were both encouraged by the idea that the rise of modern science, the most spectacularly successful social institution of the past 300 years, can teach philosophers the most important lessons, both about how things are and about what it is to understand them. But from the beginning, naturalism and empiricism have typically stood in significant tension with one another. The furniture of Newton's world doesn't include the contents of Locke's mind. And Hume can find nothing in experience by which we could come to know or understand laws such as Newton's as having the necessity that distinguishes laws from mere regularities. And nor is that tension between them a characteristic only of the Enlightenment forms of naturalism and empiricism. It equally afflicts their 20th century forms. The two principal wings of the Vienna Circle, which Carnap struggled heroically to keep from flying off in different directions, were distinguished precisely by their answers to the question, when empiricism and naturalism conflict, which should be relaxed or given up? Schlick urged the preeminence of empiricism, while Neurath was committed to the priority of naturalism. Their descendant Quine never fully reconciled his logical empiricist hostility to modality with his naturalist privileging of the deliverances of science, including its teaching us about laws. But the classical pragmatist versions of naturalism and empiricism fit together much better than the versions that historically preceded them in the Enlightenment and succeeded them in logical empiricism. Far from being in tension, the pragmatist versions complement and mutually support one another. Both the world and our knowledge of it are construed on a single model, as mutable contingent products of statistical selectional adaptational processes that allow order to pop to the surface and float in a sea of random variability. Both nature and experience are to be understood in terms of the processes by which relatively stable constellations of habits arise and sustain themselves through their interactions with an environment that includes a population of competing habits. There is no problem in principle in finding a place for experience, construed as learning, in nature, construed as evolving. Nor is there any analog of the traditional complementary problem of understanding how experience, construed as the dynamic evolution of habits, can give its subjects epistemic access to the modally robust habits of the things those knowers and agents interact with, adapt, and adapt to. The pragmatist forms of naturalism and empiricism, unlike the Enlightenment forms and the logical positivist forms, are two sides of one coin. The pragmatist conception of experience is recognizably a naturalized version of the rational process of critically winnowing and actively extrapolating commitments according to the material incompatibility and consequence relations they stand into one another, that Kant described already as producing and exhibiting the distinctive unity of synthetic apperception. For that developmental process, too, is selectional, though not statistical. Some commitments, for Kant, both theoretical and practical, thrive and persist in concert with their fellows, while others are modified or rejected as unable to flourish in that environment. It might be thought fanciful of me to focus on this common structure in light of the substantial difference between the conceptions. Kant's process, one might say, is structured by rational, conceptual, normative relations of incompatibility and consequence, while the pragmatist's version is structured by natural, causal, alethic modal relations of incompatibility and consequence. But I think the pragmatists would disagree with such an objection, for they introduce not only a new conception of experience, but also a new conception of reason. They understand the rationality of the theoretical physicist as continuous with the intelligence of the culturally primitive hunter and the skill of the non-human predator. The grooming and development of discursive, cognitive, and practical commitments is a learning process of a piece and sharing a structure with the achievement of practical attunement to an environment and the acquisition of habits successful in that environment that in one form or another is a part of the natural history of all sentient organisms. Reason and intelligence in this sense can be seen, albeit in an inflexible and unlearned form, already in the maintenance of an equilibrium by that emblem of the Industrial Revolution, the flywheel governor. The nature of the pragmatists is in their sense, through and through, a rational nature, not just the part of it that's intelligible as actually being experience. The more specific strategy by which the classical American pragmatists sought to naturalize the concept of experience, to demystify it and domesticate it, to disentangle it from 2 centuries of Cartesian encumbrances, is what I'll call fundamental pragmatism. This is the idea, roughly, that one should understand knowing that as a kind of knowing how, to put it in Ryle's terms. That is, believing that things are thus and so is to be understood in terms of practical abilities to do something. Dewey, in particular, saw the whole philosophical tradition down to his time as permeated by a kind of Platonism or intellectualism that saw a rule or principle, something that is or could be made conceptually or propositionally explicit, behind every bit of skillful practice. He contrasted that approach with the contrary pragmatist approach, which emphasizes the implicit context of practices and practical abilities that forms the necessary background against which alone states and performances are intelligible as explicitly contentful believings and judgings. In this reversal of the traditional order of explanation, Dewey is joined by the Heidegger of being and time, with his project of understanding Vorhandenheit as a precipitate of the more primordial Zuhandenheit, and again by the later Wittgenstein. All 3 thinkers, I think, should be understood as downstream from Kant's fundamental insight about the normative character of cognition and agency. And all 3 share a commitment to the explanatory priority of norms implicit as proprieties of practice to norms explicit as rules or principles. I mean the rubric fundamental pragmatism to be a relatively loose and elastic description, whose parameters can be adjusted or interpreted so as to fit the methodology of many thinkers, who might otherwise differ in many ways. It's supposed, for instance, to include both the order of explanation that led Quine to criticize what he called the myth of the museum in thinking about meaning, and that Sellers employs in criticizing what he called the myth of the given in thinking about sensory experience. It depends on a contrast, which may be filled in different ways, between something on the implicit, know-how, skill, practical ability, or practice side, and something on the explicit, conceptual, rule, principle, representation side. So we might distinguish 2 grades of intentionality, practical and discursive. Practical intentionality is the kind of attunement to their environment that intelligent, non-linguistic animals display. The way they can practically take or treat things as prey or predator, food, sexual partner or rival, and cope with them accordingly. Discursive intentionality is using concepts in judgment and intentional action, being able explicitly to take things to be thus and so, to entertain and evaluate propositions, to formulate rules and principles of action. The fundamental pragmatist aspiration in these terms is to be able to exhibit discursive intentionality as a distinctive kind of practical intentionality. That project can take a strong reductionist form. For instance, what I've elsewhere called the pragmatist version of artificial intelligence claims that there is a set of practices or abilities that are non-discursive, in the sense that each one of them can be engaged in or exercised by non-discursive creatures, and yet which can be algorithmically elaborated into the discursive capacity to use concepts and speak an autonomous language. But fundamental pragmatism need not take such a strong reductive form. One might claim, more modestly, that discursive activity, from everyday thought to the cogitations of the theoretical physicist, is a species of practical intentionality, a determination of that determinable. And indeed, one that's intelligible as having developed out of non-discursive practical intentionality, while still maintaining that it's a wholly distinctive variety. Now, when classical American pragmatism is looked back upon from the perspective of the analytic movement that dominated Anglophone philosophy for at least the last half of the 20th century, it can easily appear that a decisive wrong turn was taken after Peirce. That pragmatist founder member was principally concerned to advance the philosophical understanding of modern logic, symbolic and natural languages, and the natural sciences, a constellation of topics that remained at the center of the analytic tradition. In his Logic of Relations, Peirce independently achieved the bonanza of expressive power that Russell correctly saw in Frege's logic. But what did Peirce's successor pragmatists make of that achievement? Particularly in contrast to what Russell made of Frege, it would seem from a later vantage point that an opportunity was missed. James, for instance, had little interest in logic and wrote almost nothing about it. In striking contrast to his Hegelian colleague, Josiah Royce, who saw in the algebraic constructions of Alfred Bray Kempe, about whom he had learned from Peirce, a tool with which he hoped to solve the riddle of how to elaborate spatiotemporal relations from a purely conceptual basis. The logic Dewey wrote his late important book about was unrecognizable as such to those of his readers in 1938 whose paradigm of logic was to be found in the works of Frege, Russell, and Carnap. The only pragmatist whose concern with logic matched and was recognizable as continuing the tradition that Peirce initiated was the homegrown neo-Kantian C.I. Lewis, the founder of 20th century modal logic, and who saw his own work as an attempt to synthesize the approaches of his teachers, James and Royce, and in turn passed on pragmatist ideas to his students, Quine and Goodman. Again, though James was surely by far the best writer among the classical triumvirate, his philosophical interests focused on experience rather than language. Dewey did write a lot about language, what he called the tool of tools. He has many good things to say about the relations between meaning and use, particularly in Chapter 5 of Experience and Nature that we just heard about from Dave Beiseker. But he too, I think, would not be recognizable to later philosophers of language as one of their number. The linguistic turn happened largely without the American pragmatists. But by the linguistic turn here, I principally mean putting language at the center of philosophical concerns and understanding philosophical problems to begin with in terms of the languages one uses to formulate them. But there is a more specific significance one can take language to have. By lingualism, I shall mean commitment to understanding conceptual capacities, discursiveness in general, in terms of linguistic capacities. Michael Dummett epitomizes a strong version of this order of explanation. He says, "We have opposed throughout the view of assertion as the expression of an interior act of judgment. Judgment, rather, is the interiorization of an external act of assertion." Dewey says almost exactly that in Chapter 5 of Experience and Nature. A weaker version of lingualism would claim only that language is at least a necessary condition of discursiveness, not that it's a sufficient condition, that it can at least in principle be made intelligible independently of talk about discursive commitments. Now, I don't think that the pragmatists after Peirce just missed the linguistic turn. Dewey is an obvious exception, though particularly in Experience and Nature. It's much less pervasive a topic elsewhere. Rather, what they did was develop their thought about language as what was distinctive of human beings within the context of a different approach to understanding that crucial phenomenon of language, one that was complementary to the approach of the soon-to-be dominant analytic tradition. The Frege-Russell-Carnap approach to language takes as its paradigm artificial, formal, logistical languages, articulated by explicit rules. The American pragmatists, like their fellow fundamental pragmatists, the Heidegger of Being and Time and the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations, address rather natural languages, which they think of anthropologically as aspects of the natural history of a certain kind of being. Their focus, to begin with, is not on meaning, but on use, on discursive practices, skills, and abilities, on what one must be able to do in order to count as saying or thinking that things are thus and so. We can think of these two approaches as distinguished by their preferred order of explanation. The question is, which comes first, semantics, the theory of meaning, or pragmatics, the theory of the use of expressions? The logistical tradition begins with semantics. It begins by stipulating the association of some kind of semantic interpretants, paradigmatically extensions, with basic expressions, and deriving associations for more complex ones, or stipulating basic rules of derivation and then seeing what consequence relation they jointly determine. The question of how it's appropriate to use expressions governed by those rules is then deferred to a subsequent pragmatic theory, to which this current of thought has not traditionally devoted a great deal of attention. By contrast, the pragmatist tradition begins with pragmatics, an account precisely of how it is appropriate to use expressions, what discursive practice is. And it's true that the pragmatists, correspondingly, have not traditionally given a lot of attention to the specifics of the semantics, the theory of meaning, that goes with such a pragmatics. But I think we can see two principles that govern fundamental pragmatists' understanding of the relation between pragmatics and semantics in thinking about language. They express complementary aspects of the sense of pragmatism in the philosophy of language that consists in insisting that semantics must answer to pragmatics. First is what I'll call methodological pragmatism. This is the principle at the point of associating meanings, extensions, contents, or other semantically relevant whatsitses with linguistic expressions has to be to codify, that is, to make it possible to express explicitly proprieties of their use, to express the norms that implicitly govern our discursive practices. I think we can discern commitment to this methodological principle even in a semantic nihilist such as the later Wittgenstein. For one thing he means by saying that language is a motley is that so many and so various are the uses of any expression that there are no realistic prospects of systematizing them by associating some underlying meaning on the basis of which one then hopes uniformly to derive their various uses, say by one rule for declarative uses, another for imperative ones, another for hypothetical, and so on. If the varieties of uses is open-ended and unsurveyable, then there's no prospect for semantic theorizing in philosophy, precisely because the only point of such theorizing would be systematizing those proprieties of use. The second principle governing a fundamental pragmatist understanding of the sense in which semantics should answer to pragmatics is what I'll call semantic pragmatism. This is the principle that in natural language, all there is to affect the association of meanings, contents, extensions, rules, or semantically relevant whatsits with linguistic expressions is the way those expressions are used by the linguistic practitioners themselves. Formal semantics for artificial languages can content itself with the explicit stipulation of such rules or associations of meanings by the semantic theorist working in a semantic metalanguage. But philosophical semantics for natural languages is obliged to say what it is about the practices the users of those expressions engage in, or the abilities they exercise, in virtue of which they should be understood as governed by those rules, as binding themselves by those norms, or as conferring those meanings on their acts. Semantic pragmatism in this sense is a kind of use functionalism about meaning. Again, given his practice, I think commitment to such a principle can be attributed even to such a semantic pessimist as the later Wittgenstein, precisely in virtue of his criticism of various traditional ways of thinking about meaning or content for their failure to live up to this requirement. And that sort of strategy is equally evident in Dewey's criticisms of traditional intellectualist and mentalist conceptions of the content of our mental acts. The combination of methodological and semantic pragmatism, the two senses in which semantics can be taken to answer to pragmatics, broadly construed, might be called linguistic pragmatism. It's one natural way of applying fundamental pragmatism to systematic theorizing about language, not because philosophy is about words, but because language is what makes us the creatures that we are. One of the clearest and most emphatic proponents of that conjunctive doctrine among recent philosophers is Dummett, though of course he doesn't associate it with pragmatism of any kind. But Quine does carry forward this general pragmatist tradition in the philosophy of language when he criticizes Carnap's two-stage picture of language, according to which first meanings are stipulated, and only subsequently are theories formulated to determine which of the sentences with those meanings are true. That division of labor makes sense for artificial languages. But to understand natural languages, we have to understand how the one thing that we do, use the language, can serve at once to settle the meanings of our expressions and determine which of them we take to be true. Linguistic practice is not illuminated by postulating language theory or meaning belief distinctions of the Carnapian kind. As Quine famously concludes an early essay on Carnap, the lore of our fathers is a fabric of sentences. It's a pale gray lore, black with fact and white with convention. But I found no substantial reasons for concluding that there are any quite black threads in it or any quite white ones. In fact, though he didn't know it, in making this pragmatist point against Carnap, Quine was recapitulating one of the important ways in which Hegel moved beyond Kant. For Kant, all of our empirical activity, cognitive and practical, is discursive activity. In endorsing judgeable contents and practical maxims, knowers and agents are applying concepts. In fact, in a strict sense, all Kantian knowers and agents can do is apply concepts. Though further concepts may be developed thereby, for instance, by judgments of reflection, one must always already have concepts in order to be apperceptively aware of or experience anything. Hegel thought that Kant was uncharacteristically, but still culpably, uncritical about the origin of our primordial concepts. The locus of those concepts, Hegel thought, lies in language, not in some kind of experience understood as prelinguistic. Language, he said, is the Dasein of Geist, that is, of the whole normatively articulated discursive realm. In this connection, looking over his shoulder at Hegel, Dewey says, language in its widest sense is the medium in which culture exists and through which it's transmitted. For Hegel, no less than for Quine and for Dewey, we must understand linguistic practices as both instituting conceptual norms and applying them. It's precisely by applying concepts in judging and acting that conceptual content is made more determinate going forward, and shows up as always already determinate, in the only sense in which conceptual contents are determinate, when we look back over a course of experience. Pragmatists who have made the linguistic turn take it that the most important feature of the natural history of creatures like us is that we have come into language, come to engage in distinctively linguistic practices and to exercise distinctively linguistic abilities. This notion of coming into language is gaining currency in contemporary linguistics by contrast to what Dewey had already diagnosed as an unreasonably Cartesian notion that we learn language. What we do is come into the practices of language. This is both an ontogenetic and a phylogenetic achievement. Understanding it requires, at a minimum, addressing three large, interconnected kinds of questions. These concern what I'll call the issues of demarcation, of emergence, and of leverage. The demarcation question is definitional. How are linguistic practices and abilities, and hence, the linguist about discursivity, like Dewey, claims, discursive ones? How are linguistic discursive practices and abilities to be distinguished from non-linguistic, non-discursive ones? The emergence question concerns the requirement that any account of language that aspires to being naturalistic, in even a very broad sense, must explain the possibility of the transition from the non-linguistic, non-discursive, to the linguistic, discursive practices and abilities. How are the abilities that we can see in non- or pre-linguistic creatures recruited, deployed, and transformed so as to amount to linguistic ones? The leverage question is then how to characterize and explain the massive qualitative differences in capacity between linguistic and non-linguistic creatures, the bonanza of new abilities and possibilities that language opens up for those that do make the transition to culture. One of the principal accomplishments of the classical American pragmatists is the attention they gave to the problem of emergence, to displaying the continuities that make it naturalistically intelligible that species and individuals should be able to cross the boundary separating the pre-linguistic from the linguistic. In Experience in Nature, Dewey sets up the emergence problem this way. He says, upon the whole, professed transcendentalists have been more aware than have professed empiricists of the fact that language makes the difference between brute and man. The trouble is, they've lacked a naturalistic conception of its origin and status. And in The Logic, he expands on this thought. Any theory that rests upon a naturalistic postulate must face the problem of the extraordinary differences that mark off the activities and achievements of human beings from those of other biological forms. It's these differences that have led to the idea that man is completely separated from other animals by properties that come from a non-natural source. The development of language in its widest sense out of prior biological activities is, in its connection with wider cultural forces, the key to this transformation. The hallmark of an untenable intellectualism, Dewey thinks, is an appeal to an inexplicable saltation, the ultimately miraculous dawning of consciousness or self-consciousness, the infusion of reason into a brute. The desire to provide a more satisfactory response to the emergence question than that sort of Cartesian approach can offer binds Dewey together with the later Wittgenstein in a common enterprise. After all, the point of many of the Toi-Sprachspiel that the latter describes is to show us how features of discourse that might seem mysterious in a sense that calls for the invocation of a Cartesian discontinuity can be seen to be exhibited already in practices that we can see how intelligent but non-linguistic hominins could already master. When we turn to the demarcation question, however, I think the pragmatists disappoint. What is distinctive of linguistic or discursive practices? What sets them apart from pre-linguistic or non-discursive practices? It's one's answer to this question that ties together the emergence question with the leverage question. For the criteria of adequacy for answers to those questions turn on its being the same kind of practices and abilities that one has told a story about the non-miraculous emergence of, in answering the emergence question, that one must then show can intelligibly account for the huge differences in capabilities, cognitive and practical, that come with the advent of language in answering the leverage question. Now, to ask this demarcation question, we need not assume that the emergence of language is an all or none thing. One might, with Wittgenstein, want to deny that there is, or need be, a bright line separating the discursive from the non-discursive, in favor of some sort of family resemblance view, perhaps. A pluralist incrementalist response to the demarcation question makes the emergence question easier to answer, but it makes the leverage question correspondingly more difficult. I don't think Dewey's meta-instrumentalist tool of tools line can be made to work to bring the emergence and leverage issues into harmony, but I've argued that elsewhere, and I'm not going to rehearse my complaints here. And I'm not going to address the all-important leverage question. Again, I've talked about that later, elsewhere. But the demarcation question is prior. After all, if one is going to say how Geist precipitates out of Natur, and how it transforms sentient organisms into sapient ones, one should try to say what it is. The challenge is to offer satisfactory responses to both the emergence question and the leverage question. Focusing on just one of them makes it too easy. In the passage I cited a minute ago, Dewey says in effect that the neo-Cartesian intellectualists make the leverage question too easy to respond to by ignoring, or even making it impossible to address, the question of emergence. And I've just, in effect, accused Dewey of making the complementary mistake. In any case, it's clear that the hinge that connects the issues of emergence and leverage is the question of demarcation. For the challenge is to show that the same phenomenon that one has accounted for the emergence of can leverage sentience into sapience. So demarcating the realm of linguistic or discursive practices and abilities is an absolutely essential element of the philosophical project I've been describing. I want to close with a suggestion as to one way fundamental pragmatists, those committed to understanding discursive intentionality as a kind of practical intentionality, who are at least weak lingualists about discursiveness, that is, who take engaging in linguistic practices as a necessary condition of deploying concepts, a class I'll remind you I take to include at least Peirce, Dewey, the early Heidegger, and the later Wittgenstein, how they might answer the demarcation question, and so determine definite criteria of adequacy for responses to the leverage question. My idea is that pragmatism can usefully be combined with a rationalist criterion of demarcation of the linguistic, and hence of discursiveness in general. By this I mean that what distinguishes the linguistic practice, in virtue of which we're sapient and not merely sentient beings, is its core practices of giving and asking for reasons. A necessary and sufficient condition of being a discursive practice is that some performances are accorded by it the practical, pragmatic significance of claimings or assertings. Semantically, claimable or assertable contents are propositional contents. And syntactically, what expresses those contents is declarative sentences. This combination of pragmatic, semantic, and syntactic features, lining up, asserting or claiming, propositional content, and declarative sentences, is the iron triangle of discursiveness. The pragmatist order of explanation starts with the pragmatics. The thought is that to have the pragmatic significance of an assertion, a claim, or a judgment is to be able both to serve as a reason and potentially to stand in need of reasons. So propositional contents, moving to the semantic, are those that can play the role both of premise and conclusion in inferences. Discursive practice is accordingly understood as essentially inferentially articulated. Now, commitment to a rationalist criterion of demarcation of the discursive requires disagreeing with the classical American pragmatists, and it requires disagreeing with Wittgenstein. Contrary to what he says, language does have a downtown, and it's the practice of making claims and giving and asking for reasons. Other things we can do with language on this picture are ancillary to and parasitic on these essential core functions. On this view, most of the toy practices Wittgenstein calls Sprachspiele are vocal, but not genuinely verbal. They're not really language games. The builder's utterance, for instance, in the opening slab practice, should not be understood as imperatives. They're vocalizations that have the pragmatic significance of making certain responses on the part of the builder's assistant appropriate. But to be genuine imperatives, they have to do that by saying what it is that ought to be done. And in this full-blooded sense, no practice can contain the genuine contentful imperative, bring me a slab, unless it also contains declaratives, this is a slab. Wittgenstein and Dewey are together in rejecting rationalist criteria of demarcation of the linguistic and hence of the discursive. Indeed, I want to say they're together in resisting offering any answer at all to the demarcation question. In Dewey's case, the idea of a rationalist pragmatism would probably have struck him as a contradictio in adjecto. But rationalism, as I've described it, is not a form of the intellectualism that stands opposed to fundamental pragmatism. It's wholly compatible with understanding discursive intentionality as a kind of practical intentionality, specifically as the kind that includes practices of making claims and giving and asking for reasons. It aims to say what structure a norm-instituting social practice must have in order properly to be understood as a practice of claiming and giving and asking for reasons. It offers a specific proposal for how to understand the kind of practical knowing how that adds up to cognitive claiming or judging that. It's practical mastery of inferential relations and transitions. And answering the demarcation question about discursive practice in such a rationalist manner neither makes it impossible in principle to answer the emergence question, nor obliges one to give a Cartesian answer to it. Well, I began my story about a kind of pragmatism in an unconventional place, with Kant's normative criteria of demarcation of the discursive. That is, with his idea that what's distinctive of judgments and intentional actions, and hence of us, is that judgments and intentional actions are things that we're in a distinctive sense responsible for, that they're kinds of commitments. But for Kant, that normative criterion of demarcation was also a rationalist criterion of demarcation. For he understood that responsibility, that commitment, as a distinctively rational responsibility and rational commitment, as the justificatory responsibility to have reasons for one's theoretical and practical commitments, as the ampliative responsibility to acknowledge and embrace their inferential consequences, and as the critical responsibility to revise commitments that are incompatible, that is, that serve as reasons against one another. What I've called Kant's pragmatism consists in his strategy of understanding semantic content in terms of what apperceiving subjects must do to fulfill those responsibilities. Judgeable contents have to stand to one another in relations of material inferential consequence and incompatibility. The inferential relations that constrain the process of synthesizing a constellation of commitments and entitlements that exhibits the distinctive unity of apperception. I think Wittgenstein's example teaches us that we should follow Hegel's steps towards naturalizing Kant's notion of norms by understanding norms as implicit in social practices. Normative statuses of responsibility and commitment are, for Hegel, for Dewey, and for Wittgenstein, social statuses. They're creatures of our practical attitudes and practices of taking or treating each other as responsible and committed. The move beyond Dewey and Wittgenstein to a rationalist, more specifically inferentialist pragmatism that I'm recommending is accordingly also a return to pragmatism's roots in German idealism. As Kant synthesized empiricism and rationalism, and the pragmatists synthesized naturalism and empiricism, I'm suggesting that a way forward for the pragmatist tradition is to synthesize pragmatism and rationalism in the form of a rationalist response to the demarcation question of the kind that Hegel gave. Thank you.